Chapter 19, Empires in Collision, Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, 1800 to 1914. This is Section 2, the Ottoman Empire and the West in the 19th century. Alright, both China and the Ottoman Empire felt that they didn't need to learn from the West, but they were able to avoid direct colonial rule, but essentially were diminished. They attempted this defensive form of modernization, but they suffered a split in their society between those that wanted to undertake modern reforms and those holding on to traditional values. By 1750, actually this is the sick man of Europe, by 1750, the Ottoman Empire was still strong, as the center of the Islamic world, but by 1900 was known as the sick man of Europe. And region by region, the Islamic world fell under Christian rule, and the Ottomans couldn't stop nor prevent it. The Ottomans lost territory to Russia, Britain, Austria, and even France. And when Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, it was especially devastating. And Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania were able to gain independence in the 1800s. Thus, the Central Ottoman state became very weak. The provincial authorities and local warlords gained more power, and this really limited the government's ability to raise money. And the Janissaries had become militarily ineffective. Remember, the Janissaries were a very important, effective member of society long before this. The Janissaries were the ones that removed an old caliph from power and could and put a new one, but essentially, with their lagging behind of technological developments and advancements in industrialization, they couldn't beat the stronger powers and couldn't beat Europeans, and so they became militarily ineffective. The economy was hit especially hard because of Western developments. Europeans achieved direct access to Asia, and those cheap European manufactured goods really harmed the Ottoman artisans. Foreign merchants were able to win immunity from Ottoman laws and taxes, and the government eventually relied on foreign loans to finance economic developments. Those foreign investors were the ones that were putting money into the country, and they relied on those foreigners. Alright, reform and its components. The Ottomans attempted some ambitious reforms, especially considerably further than the Chinese. They didn't have an internal crisis on the same scale as that of China. There was no internal upheaval at the core of the empire. They didn't have to deal with an explosive population growth. And the rulers were Turkic and Muslim and not foreign like the Qing in China. In the late 18th century, Selim III tried to establish new military and administrative structures. He sent ambassadors to study European methods and ideas and concepts. He even imported European advisors and actually established some technical schools. And after 1839, there were even more far-reaching measures that emerged. Some reorganization, if you will. And the beginning was a very extensive process of industrialization and modernization, and many accepted the principle that all citizens were equal, before the law. And there was this huge tide of secular legislation and secular schools, which is huge, because this used to be the center of the Islamic world. And they even created some modest educational openings for women, and those are mostly in Istanbul. Okay, this reorganization, or this Tanzimat era, is started in 1839. The Ottoman state engaged in some widespread reform that was really, like I said, some defensive modernization. Importantly, the Ottoman leadership established religious tolerance and legal equality, leading to the promotion of some various Christians actually to hold high office. The reforms pursued a Western form of modernity using law codes and court systems as well as technological infrastructure. And like I said, the reforms opened the women up for greater access to public life. Okay, supporters of the reform movement saw the Ottoman Empire as a secular state. And the reform created this new class of writers and some others known as the Young Ottomans. They urged the creation of a constitutional regime, Islamic modernism, and they were out to accept Western technology and science, but not necessarily its materialism. And Sultan Abd al-Hamid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, accepted a new constitution when he first took control in 1876 that limited the Sultan's authority, but almost immediately he suspended it and turned to this older style of despotism in the face of a Russian invasion. Now, the young Ottomans, they favored a more democratic style of rule with the constitution, the goal of, but at the same time, saving their Islamic community. They embraced the technology and the science. But, like I said, they faced pressure from Russia, and so this parliament constitution didn't last long because they returned to their despotic rule. That's like absolutism for the next 30 years. Okay, opposition coalesced around the Young Turks. These are the military and civilian elites. So we have the Young Ottomans and we have the Young Turks. They advocated a militantly secular public life, and they shifted to thinking in terms of a Turkish national state. So this is the development of some Turkish nationalism. There's a military coup, which is a military takeover, in 1908, and it gave the Young Turks real power. They antagonized the non-Turkic peoples that lived within the Ottoman Empire, and that stimulated some Arab and other nationalisms, and the Ottoman Empire completely disintegrated after World War I. So they were part of, they still existed all the way into the 20th century, but with this development of nationalism in many parts of the Ottoman Empire, they completely fell apart, and thus they were on the side that lost World War I as well. Okay, comparing China and the Ottoman Empire. And by 1909, both China and the Ottoman Empire were semi-colonies. They both gave rise to a new nationalist concept within their societies. China, the imperial system, collapsed in 1911. This was followed by a vast revolution and the creation of a communist regime in 1949 within that same territory. And the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I. And the Chinese revolutionaries rejected the old traditional Confucian culture much more than the Turkish leaders rejected Islam. And many of the Turkish people are still Islamic today. here's a map of territory that was lost by the Ottomans within different time periods. So you can see this is a vast area of land, and over time they lost significant part of their size. So by the time World War I started in 1914, this area right here, it was essentially only about a third of its size. So it's a good map that gives you guys an idea of what we're talking about here. And remember, we talked about these many different places: Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, Serbia, all of them winning their independence. And remember, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, it was especially devastating for the Ottoman Empire because they controlled access to the Indian Ocean and the rest of Asia. Okay, and this is a very interesting picture. I believe this is the signing of the first constitution for the Ottoman Empire. That's a neat picture. And that concludes Section 2, the Ottoman Empire in the West in the 19th century.